anyone here, can you hear me? Okay. Has anyone here ever felt hopeless? You ever known anyone that just felt like they just plain lost hope? Well, I'd like you to meet someone who lost hope. My son, Jake. Now, Jake's life wasn't always lacking in hope. He had a childhood that was actually full of hope and full of love and fun and accomplishment and arm wrestling and baseball and armpit farts. So proud. He was showing the neighbor how to do it. And family and friends and the boys in the band. He was also an accomplished artist. He took the top award at the governor's show in high school. And a tremendously versatile and talented musician. There he is playing electric bass. He was a high school grad and a college grad, a big brother to a little sister and a little brother. But Jake struggled mightily in his 20s. His typical young adult angst took a terrible turn. There he is in 2005, recovering from alcohol poisoning. The last month of his life, he spent homeless. And on April 5th, 2008, he was struck and killed by an Amtrak train in Santa Barbara. He was 28 years old. That's where his body landed by the tracks. What happened to Jake? Well, some might say he had a mental illness, and in fact, he did have an experience of psychosis in 2001, shortly after 9/11. Now, 50 years ago, that's an experience we might have called a good old-fashioned nervous breakdown. But today, the conventional thinking is that psychosis is a symptom of a serious chronic mental illness, and that's just exactly how Jake's problem was viewed in the psych ward at Ohio State, a symptom of a lifelong brain disease. On only his second day in the hospital, a psychiatrist said, right in front of his girlfriend, it's probably schizophrenia. When Jake was discharged, he had no official diagnosis except for psychosis, not otherwise specified. But the psychiatrist wanted to treat him as if he had bipolar disorder. What for? Just in case? It didn't make any sense to me, and it didn't make any sense to him. Do you know what the implications are of receiving a diagnosis like bipolar disorder? Well, let's take a look at what NAMI says. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're a very well-funded and well-organized group that does advocacy and education about mental illness. According to NAMI, bipolar disorder is a complex medical illness of the brain. Bipolar disorder is a chronic condition, much like diabetes. There's no cure for bipolar disorder. I'm losing a word. That's a grim prognosis. So what about schizophrenia, which was what the psychiatrist's first guess was? Is recovery from schizophrenia possible? Again, NAMI says no. The World Health Organization has identified schizophrenia as one of the 10 most debilitating diseases affecting human beings. There's no cure for schizophrenia. Now, let me explain here that a diagnosis of schizophrenia means chronic psychosis. Jake's doctors did not believe that, they didn't believe in acute psychosis, that is like a single episode. Jake's doctors did not believe that he could become completely well again. What Jake was being told was that his psychosis was evidence of a debilitating brain disease for which there was no cure. But is that true? Well, it turns out there's a raging debate going on right now. Boston University psychologist Courtney Harding has done extensive research on long-term outcomes of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Here's what Dr. Harding says. Whoops. What most Americans and even many psychiatrists do not realize is that many people with schizophrenia, perhaps more than half, do significantly improve or recover. And she goes on to say, many can be symptom-free without medication. So NAMI says incurable disease, incurable brain disease. Dr. Harding says most recover even without medication. What's true? Well, let's look at the incurable brain disease position. Even if a person cannot recover from a mental illness, we're told that it's not such a big deal because psychiatry has made huge strides in the past 50 years. We're told that a psychiatrist can diagnose a mental illness with great accuracy and treat it with a corresponding medication, and the mentally ill person can then go on and live a productive and fulfilling life as long as they take their medication. So it sounds pretty good. It sounds like we've made some progress, but is it true? Well, in his new book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Robert Whittaker exposes not only the astonishing rate of growth of the mental illness epidemic in this country, he also shows us the alarming rate at which people are becoming disabled by mental illness. Here's what Robert Whittaker's found. 1955, 1 in 468 Americans were disabled by mental illness, and they were hospitalized. This was before SSI and SSDI. In 1987, we're up to 1 in 184. And then in 2007, when you'd expect to see some real progress, real positive progress, because we have Prozac and the second generation antipsychotics, we're up to 1 in 76 disabled by mental illness. Because of mental disorders, 850 adults and 250 children are added to the disability rolls every day. That's bad news. But the good news is things aren't this bad everywhere in the world. In the World Health Organization did a study in the 1970s comparing the recovery rates from schizophrenia in developing countries with the recovery rates from schizophrenia in industrialized countries. And what they found was that the recovery rates were roughly twice as high in the poor countries as they were in the richer countries. They were so surprised by this that they thought it must be a mistake. And they repeated the study in the 1990s, and they got the same results. The difference in outcomes was so dramatic that WHO researchers concluded that just living in a developed country is a strong predictor that a person diagnosed with schizophrenia will never fully recover. Wow. Now, why would the poor countries have greater success achieving recovery than the richer countries? Well, Boston psychiatrist Daniel B. Fisher has an interesting answer. He says, we have ceremonies of segregation and isolation, which is really what our labeling and our hospitalization process is. They have ceremonies of reintegration and connection. And what's also interesting in those WHO studies, in the poor countries, only 16% of patients were maintained on antipsychotic medication. Well, you may say, okay, that's poor countries, poor people, they're different. But things get really interesting when we look at developed countries that have had both kinds of ceremonies. They've had both non-recovery and recovery. They've had both failure and success. And one such place is Finland, Sweden. Population 60,000. During a 4-year period in the 1990s, first-time psychotic patients were taken care of here in a novel way. Psychosis was seen as a crisis to be overcome. A session with the whole family is arranged within 24 hours of the onset of psychosis. Antipsychotic drugs are avoided and hardly ever used, and I got cut off here, but hospitalization is avoided and hardly ever necessary. From 1992 to 1996, 37 first-time psychotic patients were treated using this method. Now, normally in this population, you would expect to see about half of those patients get stuck in psychosis and become chronic and then get the label of schizophrenia. So of 37 patients, you'd expect about 18 new schizophrenia cases. But by helping psychotic patients using this method, there were none, 0. No new cases of schizophrenia in that 4-year period. And by 1998, only 2 of those 37 patients were taking any psychiatric medication. So you could say, well, that's Sweden. It could be some sort of Swedish fluke. But it's not, because something very similar is happening in Western Lapland right now. Star marks this Western Lapland up there. This particular region in Finland used to have one of the highest rates of schizophrenia in Europe, with a population of around 70,000 in the 1970s and 80s. About 25 new cases of schizophrenia appeared there each year, and those patients regularly became chronically ill. But today, the long-term outcomes for psychotic patients in Western Lapland is the best in the Western world. And this area now sees very few new cases of schizophrenia. How did they do it? How did they beat schizophrenia? Well, psychiatrists in Western Lapland developed a distinct concept of psychosis. They believe that psychosis arises from severely frayed social relationships, not a brain disease. The treatment model they used in Western Lapland was very similar to what they did in Sweden. It's called open dialogue therapy, and from the outset, the therapists strive to give both the patients and the family a sense of hope. Psychiatrist Birgitta Alakari says, "The message that we give is that we can manage this crisis. We have experience that people can get better, and we have trust in this kind of possibility." And what's also remarkable is most of these patients were never even exposed to antipsychotic medication. Psychiatrist Viljo Rakalainen, and I have a theory that what's driving them crazy is the pronunciations of the names. Try without antipsychotics, he suggests. You can treat them better without medication. They become more interactive. They become themselves. Open dialogue therapy has been practiced in Western Lapland now for 17 years, and it has transformed the way psychosis is viewed in this area. Now only 2 or 3 new cases appear each year. New cases of schizophrenia appear each year in this area instead of 25. That is a 90% drop in the schizophrenia rate. This really happened. It's not just a theory. So you could say, well, that's Scandinavia. Maybe they're different. But guess what? It's not just happening in Scandinavia. Some psychiatrists have been having similar success right here in the US for decades. In the early 1960s, psychiatrist William Glasser developed a new approach to psychiatry, which he called reality therapy, an answer to the basic question of what is wrong with a person who has psychiatric problems. Dr. Glasser's answer is, everyone who needs psychiatric treatment suffers from one basic inadequacy. He is unable to fulfill his essential needs, respect and relatedness. He says we need to go about fulfilling those needs by doing what is realistic, responsible, and right. And that's his basic theory, which is described in his book, but for now I just want to highlight the kind of results he had. Dr. Glasser used reality therapy in the Ventura School for Girls in Southern California. It was a last stop before prison for severely troubled girls. And his mentor, Dr. G.L. Harrington, used reality therapy in the VA Neuropsychiatric Hospital in West Los Angeles, Building 206. Building 206 was a final destination in life for chronic schizophrenia patients. Men there had already been hospitalized for an average of 15 years. They were receiving custodial care, period. But under Dr. Harrington's care, men who had been written off as hopeless were helped to recover their humanity by restoring respect and relatedness. Many were discharged and helped to live outside the hospital and off medication. So what kind of results? Dr. Glasser says, naturally, we did not succeed with everyone, but we do with about 80%. Then in the 1970s, a project called Diabasis was developed in San Francisco by psychiatrist John Weir Perry. Diabasis was an inpatient residence. It's designed to help severely psychotic young people without the use of medication and as part of that county's community mental health system. Dr. Perry says, 80% of our clients not only improved with no medications, but most went on growing after leaving us. Also in the 1970s, Dr. Loren Mosher developed an experimental treatment program he called Soteria. There's the actual Soteria house. His experiment was designed to answer a simple question, and it's so simple that I had to write it down on a card here. Could persons newly labeled schizophrenic and deemed so dysfunctional as to require hospitalization be successfully treated in a small, home-like, non-hospital setting without antipsychotic drugs? And the answer, in every instance, people treated psychosocially did as well as or better than those treated conventionally with drugs. And of course, they didn't suffer the adverse side effects of the medications. Dr. Mosher says recovery from psychosis was not only possible, but probable and to be expected. What's especially notable about Dr. Mosher is that although he was chief of schizophrenia studies at the National Institute of Mental Health, he questioned the brain disease model that everyone else was embracing. And even though his Soteria experiment was a success, the National Institute of Mental Health shut it down and suppressed the good news about recovery without medication. Why? Why would they do such a thing? Why isn't the truth getting out? Mainstream psychiatry clings tenaciously to its insistence that schizophrenia is a brain disease. Throughout my son Jake's struggle, whenever he crossed paths with a psychiatrist, he was told that his problem was a brain disease like diabetes, and that the antipsychotics were like insulin for diabetes, like insulin for diabetes. We heard this hopeless message over and over again. Why? Where is this message coming from? Well, in 2009, in this country, we spent $24.5 billion on antidepressants and antipsychotic medication alone. That's roughly twice what we spend on diabetes medication. Could it be that this powerful industry funds and promotes a very different message than recovery is possible? Well, let's reflect on what we've seen here. We've seen that people diagnosed with psychosis and schizophrenia can recover completely in poor countries, in Scandinavia, and even right here in this country if they can find effective care. I forget what's next. If they can find effective care. What? What?
Common denominator.
Oh, yes. Are you seeing a common denominator? Have you seen a common denominator in all this recovery? Well, again, Boston psychiatrist Daniel B. Fisher has an interesting answer. He says, people who have shown significant or complete recovery from severe mental illness have cited hope as an extraordinarily important component in their recovery. And Dr. Fisher's answer seems especially valid and compelling when you realize that he himself has recovered completely from a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Oops. I'm losing my memory. I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind. Hope. What fosters recovery is hope by restoring respect and relatedness. Hope seems to be the common theme here. So let's take this back to my son, Jake. You might say that Jake died from a deficiency of hope. And I think what also killed my son was a deficiency of truth. The truth is, complete recovery from psychosis is possible and even probable. It happens all the time, all over the world. And it could happen right here, right now. That is the truth. I raised Jake for most of his childhood as a single mom, and sometimes I wasn't sure if I was capable of the task, but one thing I was sure of, I knew that if he were ever threatened with harm, I had no doubt that I could kill with my bare hands if I had to protect him. Well, great harm did come to Jake. He's dead. And sadly for me, I've discovered that love does not die with death. I love Jake as intensely as I ever did, and I am so hurt and so angry that I could kill with my bare hands. I just want to kill all these lies with my bare hands. These lies about managing brain diseases are insane. Let's stop the insanity over insanity.